All right, so this is the first example that we will do, but there will be a lot of me talking and showing you things that you don't care about first. But after all of that talking, this is what we will do. It's not that special, but come on. Oh, it's not the space bar.
Wow. Oh, wow. Wow. How big is the background?
Wow. So, this is super simple, but before we get there, there are just a couple of things that I want to talk about first. Today, as you might have guessed, we will do tracking. Yay! I will talk about what tracking is first. Afterwards, I will also talk about what stabilizing is, and then we will actually do it. So first, I will just talk and I will listen to myself and you will listen to myself. And so much listening will happen and afterwards doing. Oh, yeah, and the second example that we'll do today, just in case you feel like, oh, this is all, it's not. This is the second example. It analyzes and it's sand. Yeah, so this is the second thing that we will do. Okay, so how do I get out of this? I'm just too stupid to work with this. Anyway, in the files that we got today, we have an MP4, which is called wall.mp4. I will do the first steps first. I will drag it into my project panel here to import it. Then I want to make sure, whenever we work with tracking or stabilizing, that we will choose composition settings that are precisely the same as our original footage. So up here, I can see that this has a specific length, a specific size, and also it has a frame rate. The frame rate is different to what we are used to. Usually we work with 25 frames per second, but most cameras work with 30 because America's just, well, special. And they try to force their standards onto others, but in the end it's 25 most of the time. So I drag this onto the new composition icon, and I will first talk to you about what tracking is. Tracking is following how a pattern of pixels are moving across the screen and then doing something with that information, either translating that path that they go into an actual position path. It could also be used for stabilizing, and when you do it with a lot of different points, it can also create a 3D version of your scene as well as a 3D camera matching the motion of the actual camera that was filming this. There's a second method which does not work with small patterns, but it works with larger areas. I will also show that, but we will use that second method only in the advanced course because it gives us a lot of advanced options that we don't want to talk about just yet. To do a very simple tracking, I will go to Window and I will open up the tracker. In here, I have 4 buttons, but essentially I can only do 3 things. I can either do a camera track, which is what we'll do later. We can do a warp stabilizer, which is also what we will do later, or we can use the track motion and the stabilize motion. These 2 buttons you will probably never use in the future, but I will still show you how it works just so that you understand how a computer does tracking. I do the track motion, and what it does is it opens my file into the layer panel. So I can focus on just this layer. I can then see that I get a tracking point. If I zoom into my timeline here, let's go to 200%, I can see that the tracking point consists of 3 things. We have a center, we have a feature area, and we have a search area. Essentially what this does is it looks for the feature that is within this area, and as we go from one frame to the next, it searches for this feature within the larger area. I can just click inside here and can move it, for instance, onto this crack in the wall. Let's make this a little bit larger like this. So I can say, look for this crack in all the future frames as well, while only looking within this area. Otherwise, if this area is too large, it might find something that looks similar, for instance, this part over here or this one here, and it accidentally jumps from here to here. So this is why we usually have these two things, a feature region and a search region or search area. Then I can say that I want to track forward. So down here, I have a track forward button. I could also say that I as well want to track my rotation and scale, but then I just have a second tracker that does the same thing. For now, I keep it simple and I just track forward. What I then see is how it plays through my video and how it's following along. Let me just pause this and go outside. And I continue going forward. So as this moves around, the tracker's following it. Let's just let it finish. After this is done, I can, for instance, create a null object, Command-Alt-Shift-Y. I can then choose the null object as a target. You don't need to remember this. And I can hit Apply. After I've done that, my null object is now moving precisely where that dot is. So when I play back, I can see the null object is now attached to the wall. I can then also take other things and attach it to the wall. I could, for instance, create a text. And let's make this one bold. And I can just parent it to the null object. Maybe I move it with the center to the null. And when I now play back, I can see how the center of my text will always be attached to that place in the wall. Doesn't make too much sense in this scenario here, but this is generally how a feature tracker is working. This feature tracker is also used in a 3D tracker. But before I go to that, I will quickly show you the alternative. So if you ever look for tracking tutorials for After Effects, you will probably not get around Mocha. To apply Mocha, we would go to, in the newer versions in 2019, go to Animation, and then we choose Track in Boris FX Mocha. Mocha is a separate program that always comes with After Effects. In older versions of After Effects, this was a completely separate program that could only be launched through After Effects. In the newer versions, this is working a bit differently. Because some of us are still working with older versions of After Effects, this is also one of the reasons why I want to talk about Mocha later on in the next quarter, because it works very differently in this newer version. In the newer version, we just click the Mocha button here, and it launches a window, which then lets me access Mocha itself. So let me close these things out. And this is Mocha. Here we create shapes. For instance, I could create a shape around this one here. Maybe I make the edges a little bit sharper so that it fits to that brick here. I can then say that I want to track the perspective as well, and I can say that I want to track forward. What this one does is it looks at all the stuff that is within this shape, and it detects how it is moving in 3D space. It does not give us a 3D translation later on. It is more of a corner pin or a mask that we get. So let's just wait for this to be finished. Shouldn't take too long. Ta-da! Then I need to save this, so it's saved within the plugin, and I can close this window. Now, all that stuff that I've done is saved within the Mocha AECC plugin. I could then, for instance, open up the mat, and I could say that I want to create masks based on all the visible layers that I have. Right now, it's just one. So I say I want to create a mask, and now I have a mask of just this one brick. I could, for instance, use this one to color this brick into a different color. For that, I could duplicate the layer. In the bottom layer, I delete the mask. In the top layer, I delete the plugin. So if I single view this, I only have this one here. There's one neat little plugin that I could apply to make this mask look a little bit nicer, which is the Refine Soft Matte. In here, I could then change my radius, for instance, to 5 and get rid of the decontaminate colors. So here, I'm now getting a nice soft mask that does pretty much the same thing as the Refine mask in Photoshop, but it does it on every frame. I can now alter this, for instance, by adding some, by adding some curves. And I could, for instance, go into the red channel and get rid of red. And then I could go into the green channel and add some green. And to make this look a little bit more natural, I could change my contrast here a little bit. If I now play this back, maybe just add half the speed and half the resolution, I now have this colored in without having to do that much manual stuff. Easy, isn't it? The other nice thing that I can get out of Mocha is a corner pin. So here I could go back to Mocha and I can go back to Mocha and I could say, let's go back to the beginning, that I want to see what a surface would look like. And a surface essentially just gives me a corner pin, and I need to define where these corners are. Right now it's a little bit weird because the shape that I've drawn is exactly the same shape that my corner pin will have, but later on we will use it, for instance, to track phone screens in order to replace them with our own content. Then it makes a little bit more sense. But let's quickly take a look here. I could then say that I want to get out the tracking data as a corner pin, and I want it to be applied to, for instance, this solid here. So I choose the solid and I say export tracking data. Alrighty. Where did it go? Am I blind? There we go. Now we have a corner pin here that just places this element over there. I could then, for instance, instead of having a solid, have another composition. In here I could have some text. Maybe I stretch it, you will see in a moment why. And I replace this with the composition. And now I have my text written on that brick. So this is what planar tracking is. We can do a lot more stuff with planar tracking. We can do some hardcore stabilization, but this is stuff that we will talk about in the next course. And you can see it takes a lot of steps. We have to apply this plugin, we have to go into it, we have an entirely new interface, new masks and stuff. So lots of stuff that would be too much for us. Now let me show you another way that we could go, which makes everything a lot easier for us, which is the 3D camera tracker. For that, I simply select the layer and I choose the track camera button here. Alternatively, I can also apply it. By the way, did we ever do this? Control tab. Let's maybe start with that in a moment. So normally when we apply effects, we go on the right hand side here to the effects and presets. But in our first session, we applied a plugin, or we installed a plugin that is called FX Console. And with this one, we can apply plugins just like we can use the Shift-C inside of Cinema 4D. So I would hit Control-Tab, and I could just look for the camera, and then I can see in my list here is the 3D camera tracker. So I can either go through the panel here, or through the effects and presets, or I can use the Control-Tab shortcut and look for the plugin. In the top left corner, I have this super tiny interface where it first initializes and then it tracks through the scene. What it's essentially doing is it shoots hundreds, maybe even thousands of feature trackers onto our footage. So the first tracker that I've shown you, this is what it will do automatically with hundreds of them. Then it will evaluate them. If things overlap in a way that don't make sense, it will delete those tracks, but if everything makes sense, it will create points in 3D space for us, and we will have a camera. Since I don't get an error message, everything seems to go fine. When I select the 3D camera tracker, I see all these pretty dots over here. However, there's one little issue with the scene that we have here. At first, everything seems fine. I can scrub through my scene here and I can see how everything moves around in 3D space. So that's kind of nice. What I can then do is I can select multiple of these points and I can convert them into a layer and a 3D camera. So I can click and drag to make a lasso selection of this area here. Then I can right click and I can say that I want to create a text and a camera. Now everything is pretty large, and the reason is that the detection that automatically chooses how it solves the scene is wrong. We will see it in a moment. So when I apply this over here, I can already see that something looks a little bit off and it's kind of stretched. When I play it back, although it's not that bad in this example, later on will be worse. All right, so in this case, while it's not stabilized, it's still working kind of fine. And we can see how we get pretty much the same result that we got with Mocha, but a lot simpler without us having to do anything. We just click the button, create a text, and that was it. The nice thing about this is that this text here is not animated. What is animated is just the camera in 3D space. So the text just knows where it's supposed to be in 3D space, where the wall is, and then we have a camera that moves around. So I can just start adding more things to it. For instance, I could duplicate this and I could move this closer to the camera, and when I now play this back, this is not even attached to it anymore, so things can actually be floating freely. When we do something like a planar track or a point track, usually things have to be directly connected to a thing. With a camera solve, we have a 3D space, a 3D camera, and we can place elements wherever we want. Before we do this, however, we notice that the camera is very shaky. And the example that I showed you did not have a camera that was that shaky. So the other thing that I want to show you is how to stabilize something. When you want to do a combination of 3D and stabilizing, you always need to do the stabilization first, and then you apply the 3D tracking to the stabilized end result. Let me show you how that works. Then we're done with all the talking and we do shit together. Awesome, Leonard. That's so nice. Okay, so I will start with the warp stabilizer, which is the last option. I closed it already. Never mind. It was the button in the top right corner, or left one. Anyway, it's the warp stabilizer. This one does a very similar thing like the 3D tracker. It shoots lots of feature points, and then it knows where each point is moving, and it tries to smooth out the paths, and therefore stabilizing our footage. So let's wait a few seconds for this to be done. While it's doing that, we have different end results that we can get. We can either have a smooth motion or a no motion. No motion, for instance, is nice if you don't have a tripod, but you want it to be kind of like a tripod, so you would hold the camera very still, and then you would apply the stabilizer, say no motion, and then it will analyze the motion of your hand and get rid of it so that it looks like you were filming it on the tripod. In this scenario, because I have a 3D motion, I actually have to say that I want to smooth that motion. Then we have the smoothness. The smoothness by default is set to 50%, but this is a very bad starting point. I never ever had footage that looked good with 50%. Usually you go between 5 and 20%. If you smooth it more, usually it smooths too much and you get some weird warpings that you don't want. So for instance, if I go to, let's just overdo it to like 100, it will stabilize this. And I will quickly go to, let's just go to a quarter resolution so this plays back a bit quicker. If I now play this back, it just feels unnatural. In between there are sometimes areas where we feel, all right, so this is smooth, but overall it's warping and zooming in and out in a weird, unnatural way. Even with 50%, we still have, because apparently I'm not a smooth walker, we have in the middle a weird, like here it looks good, but then there's like this weird jittering. So some of it just can't get rid of. And if everything around it is too smooth, then these jitters in between just feel super unnatural. That is why my suggestion usually is to use values between 5 and 20. Most of the time I'm around 20%, because that way we still have a little bit of natural motion, and if we have jitters in it, we go naturally inside them, and then they don't feel that off. So now at 20%, when I play this back, this looks still very smooth and a lot better than the 50% because we don't have this super weird jitter in the middle. Then we have different methods, but to be honest, I never use any of the other ones. These are just cheaper versions, essentially. Here it would only stabilize the position. There it changes the position, scale, and rotation to stabilize. Here it does something with a 3D perspective, but the subspace warp renders usually quite quickly and is the most accurate one, so I never had a reason to choose any of the other ones. Then we have the advanced options. In some rare cases where you feel like even though I'm at 20%, it feels like something is off, it's not that as good as it's supposed to be, you can try enabling the detailed analysis. This will shoot a lot more points to analyze the surrounding. It takes about twice as long to calculate and also a little bit longer to render, but in some cases we get more accurate results and less jitters in between. In other scenarios, if you do the detailed analysis, you get worse results than before. So there's no real reason, there's no right value. It always depends on how something is filmed. In some cases, the detailed analysis does something better. In some cases, it does something worse. Alrighty. There are a couple of more things that we can do with the warp stabilizer, but I don't think that we will use them, so I will not talk about it. I will keep it quite basic. So here I can see I now have a pretty steady camera. Just to show you the difference, let me duplicate the layer, get rid of the warp stabilizer, and I will add a linear wipe to it, which I will set to 50%, which means that on the one side, I can see the original result without the stabilization, and on the left-hand side, we do see the stabilized result. When I now play this back, we can see how steady the left side is and how jerky the right side is. And all these jitters that we see on the right side, this is what the warp stabilizer has gotten rid of. Alrighty. Now here's one thing that you have to remember. It's very important. When we apply the 3D camera tracker, it ignores everything that is applied to a layer. So if I now use the 3D camera tracker and I apply it, I even get a little bit of a warning that tells me 3D camera tracker analysis ignores masks and effects applied to the same composition. To honor them, apply them in a pre-composition. And this is exactly what we need to do. So,
So on our phones, usually there's a stabilizer built in the camera.
It was already active when I was filming this.
Okay, no, that's fine. But I was just wondering, so it obviously does the same. Doesn't it minimize the quality of the video when it stabilizes it?
It always minimizes the quality of the video.
So if we're intentionally knowing that the video will be cut in After Effects and we're going to stabilize it, should we then shoot it without stabilizer on our phone, for example, or the camera we're using, just to make sure that it only gets decreased once instead of twice?
Depends a little bit. You should try it. Some cameras have a very great stabilizer. The nice thing about the stabilizer in a camera, sometimes they have a function where the camera is a little bit loose. So if you enable the stabilizer on the phone, it not only stabilizes it post filming, but it's already stabilized due to the mechanics of the camera. Also, what the camera uses is the accelerator, how is it called? This weird accelerator inside the camera that in the phone that knows how you held it. Yeah, the gyroscope, that's the one. So it uses that one also as additional information of how to stabilize it. So sometimes if you enable it, it does reduce the quality, but it gets rid of a lot of jitters beforehand, and it reduces motion blur due to jitters. And in some other cases, if you don't have a great camera, you don't, there's so many different techniques out there. But sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better. You should just try it with your camera and see how the end results are. If the stabilized footage already looks very blurry and shaky out of the camera when you have the stabilization on, then it doesn't matter. Then you should turn it off and only use After Effects for the stabilization.
Okay, great, thank you.
But a good question. Alrighty, so the 3D camera tracker ignores the effects that I have applied, which means if I apply the warp stabilizer and then the 3D camera tracker, it will not incorporate what the warp stabilizer does. What we need to do to fix this is, like the pop-up said, we need to convert this into a pre-comp. And there are two ways of doing that. Let me quickly show you in a different example why this can be tricky. Let's say I have this solid and I apply the grid effect to it. So the grid effect just creates a grid on my solid. Let me change the background color to black. I can now convert this into a composition by right-clicking on it, and I can say that I want to pre-compose. I then get a pop-up, and I have essentially two options. I can either say that I want to leave all attributes in the comp2, or I want to move all attributes into the comp2. If I say leave all attributes, and I hit enter, I could have also not done it, because I can see my scale properties are still stretched, and on this layer I have the grid effect directly applied. So nothing is really merged. The effect is still applied onto the pre-comp. However, if I pre-compose this and I say move all attributes, I can see, all right, something different is now happening. My scale is 100. I can see that the boundary is now the boundary of my composition and not the boundary of the content here. And I don't have any effects applied to it, even though I still see the effect. So now I can move this around and I see the merged version of this. This is kind of like a smart object. I can always double click on this and go inside of it and I can see the original here. So I can see how I created this black solid 2 comp 1, and I now have this as a composition with the original still inside with all the same properties. And this is what we need to do to our video here. After it's stabilized, we right click on it and we choose pre-compose. Then we could call this one stabilized, make sure that we move all attributes, and then we say OK. Now I have a composition that does not have any effects applied, so when I apply the 3D camera tracker, it will use the stabilized footage. When working with a 3D camera tracker, it usually does a good job at detecting what sort of solving method it should use. There are three ones. Either we have a tripod pan, a mostly flat scene, or a typical scene. I'm not that sure what a mostly flat scene is supposed to look like, but it's kind of like when you try to have a tripod pan but you hold it in your hand. This is kind of it. If you actually have a tripod pan where the nodal point is exactly where the center of the camera is, then you would choose the tripod option, or I think it's called flat. Oh no, tripod pan really. So a tripod pan is really a tripod pan. Then the mostly flat scene is pretty much the same thing, but you hold it in your hand. And every single thing else is typical. For some reason, because we don't have that much depth or parallax in the scene, it thinks that this is a mostly flat scene and therefore gives us not the best result possible. Because I'm moving around quite freely, I should choose the typical solving method down here. The solving of the camera usually goes a lot quicker than the tracking, so if I change this in between, it doesn't have to start over. I can now see how I get my points. Immediately I can see that these circles or targets that it's showing me are not these weird oversized ones like we've seen when I did the mostly flat scene method. I can then choose my points, right click on them, create a text and a solid, text and a camera. I can then tell this text to be left aligned in my paragraph options. And I can then just rotate it around the y-axis. And when I now play back, I have this effect here. So much talking for something that is so simple in the end. Alrighty. Do we want to do this together? Yay. All right. We start by taking the wall.mp4 and we drag it into the project panel. In here, we remember when we do stabilizing or tracking, we should always use the exact same properties of a composition like our original footage. So do not click on the new composition icon here or there. Instead, drag this onto the new composition icon. I can't stress this point enough. If I come around and I see someone where there's a comp 1, I will hit you. So, you take the MP4 and you drag it onto the new composition icon here. I will do it again. You take the video and you drag it down here. Oh, some people don't have the files yet?
I'll airdrop them.
Let's continue. Before we apply the effect, let's add the FX console to our repertoire. To do so, we will go to Window and we will look for the FX console panel that is somewhere pretty far down in the list, down here. So again, Window, then you scroll all the way down, and somewhere there you will find the fxconsole.jsx. You will click it, and it will open up a little panel.
What is it called again?
FX console. Do we all have it? Perfect. We click on the cogwheel, which will open up the options of the FX console. There's only one thing that we do want to change, and that is the shortcut. And I would choose the Control tab. So, the only thing that we changed is just the shortcut. The FX console can do a couple of more things, but I will not talk about them because I don't use them. This panel here we will never ever need in the future, so you don't need to dock it somewhere, you can just close it out. From now on, when you have a layer selected, this is crucial, a layer needs to be selected, you can hit Control Tab and just type in whatever effect you want. And the effect that we want to type in is the Warp Stabilizer. By the way, some people are irritated that the box is popping up on different places on the screen, and that is because the box will always pop up wherever your mouse is. So if my mouse is over here, it will pop up here. If it's down here, it will pop up down there. So that just needs to be understood. And again, the effect that we want to apply is called Warp Stabilizer VFX.
So we select the layer and just control that, right?
Select the layer, Control Tab, you search for the Warp Stabilizer. Once it's selected, you hit Enter, and it should be directly applied. Maybe you let me finish a sentence, then you can ask a question. So. Now, you probably have seen a blue bar that said Analyzing. After that, you saw an orange bar that said Stabilizing. And then it was gone, and that means it's done. For some settings that we change, it only needs to stabilize again, so it's the orange bar. This one usually takes a couple of seconds, then it should be done. On the other hand, there are a few settings when we change them, it needs to do the analysis again. Depending on how long your video is, this might take a couple of minutes. So you should always consider when you change which settings. Essentially, all the settings will only result in a new stabilization, so it goes quite quickly. The only exception is this one here, the detailed analysis. If you enable it, everything will be deleted and it starts over from scratch with the analysis. Just to keep that in mind, or not.
So should I click on it?
No. The what?
I noticed that mine has not stopped loading, it's still analyzing
you just let it. Depending on how strong your computer is, it might take longer. Alrighty. The one thing that we do want to change is the smoothness. So down here we change it from 50% to 20, which in most cases gives us quite good results. Now we can also test how the different resolutions affect the speed of After Effects. If we change the resolution to full and we hit the spacebar, it might not quite play back in real time. I can see how this green bar is loading, and as soon as the green bar is loaded, now it plays back in real time. And it should look quite smooth. If your computer gets super slow when you play this back the first time, what you can do is change the resolution down here from full to half, a third, or even a quarter. This does not change the way it's stabilizing, it just changes the amount of pixels that are shown. So when I play this back, even during the first playback, it plays back pretty much in real time already. Especially in the second example that we will do, this will be super helpful. For now, because it plays back quite nicely, I will keep it at full. Are we good so far?
Yes.
Nice. Next, we want to merge this together so we can apply the 3D tracker. We right-click on our layer and we choose Pre-compose. Alternatively, you can also, with the layer selected, go to Layer, or maybe it's, oh yeah, it's there, in Pre-compose, or you can use the shortcut Command-Shift-C. Results all in the same pop-up window here. Let's call this one Stabilized. Very important, choose the second option where it says Move all attributes. You cannot change this later on, so if you chose the wrong thing, you have to undo and redo. Alrighty, we hit OK. We should now have a composition that is called Stabilized. And when we take a look at our effects controls panel, it should be empty. Yeah? Good. That means we are ready to apply the second effect, which is our warp stabilizer. The 3D camera tracker. So we hit Control Tab and you can type in 3D camera tracker. You can also just type in tracker or just camera and choose the third one, either with the mouse or with the arrow keys. Yeah. Next, before we will let this, or before we want to use these points, we want to double check if the solve method chose the correct one. This should be which method? I said there are three methods. Tripod pan, mostly flat scene, and typical. And this is typical. Almost everything you do is typical. So, we go into, that sounds like an insult, like I called you basic. So, we go to the advanced options and we can see that the method used is mostly flat scene. So this is wrong, this is not what we want. So you go to the auto detect drop-down and you choose typical. Again, this is underneath the advanced options. You need to fly them open, otherwise you don't see them. Solve method should be typical. This means that it needs to solve the camera again. It does not have to do the entire analysis again, just the solving part. So after a few seconds, the orange banner should disappear and we should see the points again. So far, so good? Yeah. Awesome. Next, we want to select a couple of these points. I would just click and drag anywhere. It will change automatically to a lasso tool and it will let you select the points.
Does it matter on which frame we select these points? Because
Sometimes it does, in this scenario not so much.
No.
Yes!
Yes. It's back.
If you ever deselect the 3D camera tracker, all of your points are gone. You only see them again when you select the 3D camera tracker again. So, we select a couple of points, then we right-click on any of them, and we say that we want to create text and camera. Be careful, there's also an option to create 181 text layers and camera, which will create a text layer for every single point that you have selected. So that's not what we want. Create text and camera is the option. Yeah?
I have a lot less points than you. Is there a reason for that?
Well, maybe you suck. No, the reason might be that you went through the timeline and over time some points get lost. So if you go back to the beginning of the timeline, you might get more points. Another option might be that your resolution here was set to a quarter. If you apply the 3D camera tracker while your resolution is set to quarter, the analysis will happen at a quarter resolution and also therefore not generate as many points.
It's full.
Then I will need to take a look because I'm out of ideas.
He's exaggerating.
Now that we have the text, I just want to repeat these steps by myself. You watch them, then you understand what's happening, and afterwards we repeat them together. Okay? So, I do it first. Just me, alone. Let me save this. I select the text layer here. I will also change the color of this. For that, I will go on the right side here to the characters panel, and I just choose a white color so it pops. I would choose some very creative text. Wow! And I hit Command Enter to apply this. Now I want to align this perfectly to the wall because I can see it's not that much aligned. It feels a little bit off. I need to rotate it a little bit. And usually this is something that we have to do in the orientation. When I hit R to reveal my options of the layer, I can see that I have two different rotation properties. I have the rotation, which contains all three axes, and then on top I have one property per rotation on top. What this means is it gives us an initial orientation, so the world axis might be totally off somewhere we don't care, and is rotated weirdly. We can then tell with the orientation to have our layer sitting on an object how we want it to be, and then we can pretend this is now how the world works, and we can work with the regular rotations as if this is a flat scene. So, X, Y, and Z are the fields in here, and I can see that I need to rotate it around the Z axis, obviously, a little bit. If I want to move something only a little bit, I hold down the Command key. As I now click and drag on this value, it only moves very, very slightly, and I can adjust it until the rotation matches up with the line of the background. I can then take my Y rotation and also increase or decrease this. Apparently, I want to increase it to 90 degrees, maybe even more. I will go to the end of the animation, and I will start moving this around. Now, remember from Cinema 4D, when we are in 3D space and we want to move something around, always move it on one axis at a time, otherwise things get messy. One alternative is just hitting P and really moving it on the positions that we have here, although I would rather use the interface. You gotta be very careful. I switch to the selection mode, tool, and I hover over the axis and I can see how my cursor changes. There's a very, very tiny portion, or there's very little room where it actually changes to that cursor. So be very careful when you hover over, and then it's like, okay, it changed. No, there we go. And then you click and drag, and then you know, okay, it drags across that axis. After Effects sucks when it comes to 3D. So one thing that we notice here is the element moves a lot slower than I'm actually dragging it, because After Effects is just not a 3D software. We can do some 3D stuff with it, but right from the core, it was programmed not that nicely. I can then adjust the position. Maybe I move it a little bit closer to the camera, something like this. Then I will change the scale of this. I can either change the font size or I can change the scale here until I have my end position. Then I move the camera around and I will adjust the angle of, maybe I move it a little bit more to the back. Then I hit R again and I adjust the angle of the Y rotation until this is kind of like unrevealed or disappeared. And when I then hit the space bar to play it back, it gets nicely revealed for the wow effect. Wow. Let's do this together now. Let's revert. Okay, the first thing that we want to change is the content of our text. You can either do that with the text tool selected, just clicking inside here, and then we can edit this. So we could call this one wow, or whatever. I would again choose a white font. And then we want to zoom in a little bit. And we might see that our text is not perfectly aligned with the brick wall in the back. To fix it, we hit R for the rotation. And inside of our orientation, it's the third value that we want to change. To change it in small increments, you want to hold down the Command key and click and drag the third value to adjust it until you have the angle that you want. Next, we want to turn this already a little bit towards the camera. So we change the actual Y position, the Y rotation, not the orientation. That one should stay the way it is, but the Y rotation value is the one that we want to change. Just as a little recap, the first value are rounds. So with each time I increase this number, I turn it now 8 times by 360 degrees. So if we change this, it looks like nothing is happening because we are just rotating it always in 360 degree steps. So it's the second value that we want to change until it looks kind of like towards the camera. Then we can take our slider and move it towards the end of the animation, and here we can start adjusting this. Maybe we move it down a little bit closer towards the viewer. So I would hover over the Z-axis, move it a little bit closer. I would move it a little bit down, always hovering over the axis. You have to be very careful here.
How many degrees did you turn it on the Y?
Doesn't matter, we will adjust it later on, just around 90.
What happens if we change the orientation? Like, what's the difference?
The orientation is the initial rotation of the element. And then we can start again by rotating from 0 from that point on. Otherwise, rotations add on top of each other and things get a little bit messy. This is why After Effects has the orientation, so we can do the messy part first, and then we can know, all right, so here I start at 0, and then this would be 90 degrees and stuff like this.
Well, we have to put down the stopwatch, don't we?
No,
Why not?
we're not animating it. The camera is moving around.
Do we move it down with the orientation thing also?
No,
Position.
you move it down with the position.
How did you turn it?
And I turned it by changing the Y rotation
I mean, like the camera?
to 90. The camera angle I changed by simply going through the timeline.
Okay.
And then we adjust it until it looks something like this.
No, but like now, wait.
So far, so good.
Can you turn yours again to see what it looks like, what it should look like?
In the end, it should now look like this. Roughly 90 degrees rotated, and at the end of the timeline, placed like so.
And how should it look in the beginning?
This is the next step.
Oh, this is the end. Okay.
Here we are at the end of our timeline. At the beginning, we will then adjust once we figured out where it should be at the end.
Okay, yeah.
Next, we want to make sure that we have this magical reveal by not seeing the layer at the beginning of our timeline. So let's go back to the beginning of time and adjust the Y rotation until the layer is pretty much gone. So now we start with a blank scene and we hit the space bar and then, wow, it gets revealed.
Oh, we don't animate anything else, that's it?
Yeah.
That's fast.
So many more.
Did you want some video?
By the way, you might have seen a couple of times where we have these title sequences with texts on floors and stuff like this. This is exactly how they did it. Of course, there are some more advanced things where they work with Cinema 4D or other 3D programs, but if the text is mostly flat and it's not a 3D text, then this is pretty much what they do. So now you know how to do super fancy title sequences. Alrighty. Then I would say, this was so great, you guys. Let's do a break, and afterwards we will do the second example. Alrighty. I want to use the same project that I used before. To keep things simple, I will simply group the stuff that I already have. I do it on my own. I take these things and I drop them inside of the group icon. I can call this one wall. So now I have this project inside of this folder. Then I can start my new project by going to the Finder and I drag in the measure.mof. Maybe I shouldn't have called it measure if it detects that it's sand. Well, it apparently does not really know what it's doing. So, as always, I drag this onto the new composition icon. What I've already done with this is, it's already stabilized, so when we play it back, it's quite the smooth camera motion. So the only thing that we do need to apply is the 3D camera tracker. I will do this, so I apply the 3D camera tracker. I make sure that I do this at the full resolution. At the full resolution, it does take a little bit longer, but it will also be a little bit more accurate. In this scenario, it should definitely detect the correct method. So let's just let this run through for a moment. In the meantime, while this is doing that, I can already prepare the grid. For that, I will create a new composition. I go to my project and I click on the new composition icon. Here, I will create a composition. I will call this one grid and I make it 2000 by 2000. Rather a little bit too large than too small. Then I double check that the frame rate is consistent, so I type in 30 frames per second, and I hit OK. The length might not be matching the composition here, but doesn't matter. This is longer, so we are fine. I hit Command Y to create a new solid. Color doesn't matter. On the solid, I will apply the grid effect. On the grid, I will increase the border size. Yeah, let's do like 20. That should be intense enough. I will go back to my measure composition. Now I can see in the background it was rendering and now it's done. I can increase the track points size to see better where there are points. So I hover over the track point size and increase this. I can see that I don't get so many points where I actually want them. So one option would have been to choose the detailed analysis to get more points, but I think there should be still at some point enough points. Nah, not really. Where did the points go that I wanted? Now I'm sad. Maybe I did the detailed analysis. Let's just do this. While it's doing that in the background, I'll go back to the grid. I already know how I want to animate this. I want this to sort of squish on the sides and then squish until it reaches its final length. I hit S and I unconstrain the proportions. The height will be 5%, and then the width will be all the way down to 0. At the beginning of the timeline, I activate the stopwatch. I will then go 30 frames forward, Command Shift and the right arrow key thrice. Then I increase the width to 100%. Then I go again, 30 frames forward, Command Shift, right arrow key. And then I change this to 100. I do some weird voice stuff today. I guess I'm bored. And I counted too many times. Anyway, I select the keyframes here, and then I go to the any key and I will choose the values to, I think I kept them at 50. When I now play this back, I have this nice opening up. Let's go back here, and it's still analyzing. That's fine. I will already show you how I will create the glowing parts on the side. Yeah. I will create another composition with the same settings as before, and I will create another solid. Color doesn't matter. On this, I will apply the turbulent noise. Don't be fooled, there's also turbulent displace, but that's not what I'm looking for. I choose the turbulent noise. In here, I will increase the contrast, I think to around 300. And I might want to change the brightness as well, but let's see. I want to definitely zoom in. This should be this sort of ghosty, smoky glow thing that happens on the edges of my of the sandbox. So I go to the transform and I change the scale. I open it up and I drag it all the way to 600. I think I want this actually a little bit slower. I think I did 400. Maybe. This looks fine. Then I will change the evolution. The evolution will just morph through the noise. For that, I will quickly switch to a quarter and I increase the evolution. So now I'm getting this smoky effect. I don't want to animate this by hand. I will use an expression for that. It's a very simple one. Do you remember how to apply an expression manually?
Option plus.
Exactly. Alt or Option click on the stopwatch. The code that I use here is very simple and very logical. It's not really a specific expression, it's just logic. I first type in value. Value is the current value that it has right now, the one that I input. So in this scenario, negative 177. Then I can multiply this by time. Time represents always the current time in seconds. This way I've created sort of a motor. If I click on the outside and I now hit the spacebar, I can see how this animates all on its own. And for each second it goes by negative 177 degrees further.
Question, what if our timeline is in frames instead of times? Can we multiply?
That doesn't matter, it will always be a second. So here if I zoom in, this does not change it. So if I zoom in and I see frames, it does not change the behavior, it will always be seconds. Anyway, so this is how I can create this effect here, but it should also feel like it's going upwards. To do that, I will go to the offset turbulence. Here, I do have an array. Do we know what an array is?
The set of them.
Yeah. Here we have an array with two values. If I multiply this with something else, then it will be multiplied on both sides. So if I alt-click on here, and I take the value, and I multiply it by time, even though these are 2 and this is 1, it will be applied to both. If I then go outside and I play this back, I can see how it increases the position into the bottom left corner, because the X and the Y position are increasing. If I don't want this to happen, which I don't obviously, I change the X position to 0 and the Y position to a negative value of my choosing. I think I chose negative 200. And now, without any keyframes, I have created the stuff that is going up. Then I want this to be faded towards the top. So I hit Command Y to create another solid. On here, I will apply an effect that is called ramp, and I simply multiply this one on top, and maybe on it I add some curves and just make them a tiny bit darker, something like this. And now I have my...
This is the complicated part, or is it?
No,
No.
that's the easy part. This is the easy part where you just blindly follow and apply things. The complicated part comes right after this. But maybe we get to this point here first, and after that we do the complicated part. Sounds good? Okay. Then let's start over. I would say that we start by creating a group for all of our elements. So simply select them and drag them onto the group icon. Then you can rename the group by double-clicking on it, or, sorry, not double-clicking, stupid, by selecting it and hitting enter. And you can close it, so we can start fresh. Then we import the measure.mof. Just like before, we create a composition based on this video, so we drag it onto the new composition icon. You can also close the other ones here, it's fine. So we should now have a group. This has to do if the name is organized one way or the other. If you click on name, it switches the order alphabetically. We can't change this order manually. It is always alphabetically or the other way around.
And then with this video, we create
A new composition based on the video.
New composition.
A new composition based on the video. Just like we did earlier.
Video.
Huh? Next, we want to apply the 3D camera tracker. Before we do that, double check that your resolution is set to full. So here, switch the resolution to full. Then you can select the measure.mof layer down here, hit Ctrl Tab and look for the 3D camera tracker. Apply it and we let it run. Nice stuff happening automatically in the background. Always nice. Next, we want to create a new composition which will contain our grid. For that, we create a new comp. You can either use the shortcut Command N, or you can switch back to the project panel up here. If for some reason you don't see the project panel, like this, then you have two options. You can either click on the double arrow and you can switch to the project panel, or you can hold down the space bar and just drag this to the side until you see the project panel. Back in the project panel, we can click on the new composition icon. Here, we need to adjust our width and height to 2000 pixels. And very important, the frame rate should be 30. We don't stabilize it. In the tracker, it should be automatically chosen, that one. We will check it in a moment. We could already rename this composition as we created, so I can call this one grid. Alternatively, if you keep it comp1, you can always rename it later on. So if you now have comp1 on the left-hand side, you can just select it, hit enter, and call this one grid. Then it will also be called down here this way. Alrighty? Next, we want to create a solid. So we hit Command Y to create a new solid. Then we make sure that it's comp size. The color doesn't matter, and we hit OK. In the grid composition. So the solid that it suggests should have a size of 2000 by 2000. Can I continue? Alrighty. On that black solid, or whatever color you have, you want to apply the grid effect. Control Tab, and you type in grid. You would enter, and it should be applied. The only value I change here to keep things simple is the border, and the border should be 20. then it should look like so. Your background color might differ. You might either have the toggle transparency grid on, so here you can click this button, or if your background color of the composition is not black, it also looks different. If you're bothered by the composition background color that you see here, you can always go back to composition and composition settings. Remember, Command K, like composition. And you can change the background color here to black. But in the end, it doesn't matter because it will be transparent anyways.
I can't control tabs, like the search fit doesn't appear anymore.
Next, we want to fly this open. So we hit S for the scale. Because we wanted to scale unproportionally, we unconstrained the proportions here. We want to start with a width of 0 and a height of 5%. Whenever I see this, I have to think of an owl. So cute. Anyway. At the beginning of our timeline, we want to activate the stopwatch of the scale. What is the issue?
I can only change one of my values.
Unconstrain the proportions. So at the beginning of the timeline, we're 0 and 5, and you activate the stopwatch. Then we go 30 frames forward. Command Shift and the right arrow key once, twice, 3 times. We then only change the width, so the first value, to 100. Then we go another 30 frames forward, and we change the height to 100 as well. We can then select all 3 keyframes, go to any.green, hit the apply button, and when we play back, it should open up in an elegant way like this.
What are the values of any?
Just the default ones. 50. Are we good? Alrighty, we're getting there. So, next, let's create our glowy, moving, dusty, whatever. For that, we create yet another composition. So we go back to the composition, the project panel. Then we create a new composition, same settings as before, 2000 by 2000, black background, maybe, 30 frames per second, and this time we call this one glow, maybe?
What do we call it? Low?
Glow.
Low.
Then we create another solid, Command Y, make it comp size, color doesn't matter, and we hit enter. On that solid, we will then apply an effect that is called turbulent noise. Be aware, there's also turbulent displace, but you can simply use the down arrow to go down and then hit enter to apply.
Which one do I need? Noise or
Turbulent noise.
What is this for a plugin?
Huh?
Like that is this is not your plugin, is it?
It's not mine, I wish it was. It's pretty cool. And this one is actually free
Really?
until they start to sell it. They said they would never, but I think they will sooner or later. So for now, let's enjoy while it lasts. All right, in the turbulent noise effect, we want to change the following settings. Contrast should be 300. We want to increase the size For that, we need to open up the transform options. Inside the transform, we will find the scale. We want to use a scale of 400. Then, we know that we want to animate the evolution. Let's Alt-click on the stopwatch of the evolution. It will open up down here, and we type in value by time.
You put evolution and then what happens?
Alt-click on the evolution, then it will open up at the bottom, and you can type something in, and there we type in value multiplied by time. So, when we now play this back, nothing is happening. Can you tell me why? We didn't, yes, what didn't we do?
Change the evolution thing.
Exactly, so what is precisely happening? We have no value, so we have 0 multiplied by 1. 0 multiplied by 10. So it always ends up being 0. As soon as we change our evolution to something like 180, we immediately see that something changes. And when we play this back, it does something. The evolution takes a lot of time to calculate. So let's switch the resolution to a quarter, and then it plays back a lot quicker, almost in real time, maybe even in real time. 180. It always changes the value. As soon as you hit enter, it updates the value to the one after the expression is applied.
How come it disappears once we put it in?
Because in the beginning, it will be 0. The value here is red, and that means it will be overwritten by the expression. So first we click in, it sees 180. Then it applies the expression, and the end result is 0. If I go to 1 second, then it would be 180 degrees. If I go to 2 seconds or 5 seconds, then it would be 5 times 180 degrees. But always when I click inside, it will be the original value again. Now, we want this to move upwards, so we will apply the same expression to the offset turbulence. A little bit over the evolution. We alt-click on the stopwatch of the offset turbulence, and we type in the same expression. So again, value asterisk time. We click outside, but we want to change the values. The offset along the x-axis should be 0, and the offset along the y-axis should be negative 200. Of course, you can take higher or lower values, then the effect will be stronger. If you then click outside and you play this back, you should see how we have this evolution, and at the same time it's going upwards. Next, we want to apply a little bit of a gradation. So let's close everything down here by simply closing the options for the black solid. Then we want to create another solid. Command Y and just hit enter. On that second solid, we will apply the ramp effect. Control tab, and we type in ramp. It will show us the gradient ramp, and that is the one that we want. We hit enter, and we should see something like this. Good. Then we change the blending mode from normal to multiply. If you don't see the blending modes here, you click on the button at the bottom. On Mac, you can very easily switch the blending modes by clicking on the drop down, and then you start typing in which one you want. So if you now type in multiply, it will select multiply. Then you can hit enter and that blending mode will be applied. Of course, you can still go the manual way by just choosing it here in the list. Works the same way. Now it should look like this. Next, we want this to be a little bit lower. So after the gradient map, we apply some curves. We hit Control Tab and we type in curves. And here we just drag the midpoint down a little bit to get a nice, stronger fall off.
What? Now it's gonna make gifts.
So far so good? Alrighty. The next steps I will do very quickly because they are very simple. Afterwards we'll repeat them together. Still not the hard part. I also want some light dust particles to come. In After Effects we don't have that many options for particles, so fake it till you make it. I take the bottom layer and I duplicate it. I drag this all the way to the top. Then I will increase the contrast like crazy. I hold down the shift key and like drag the shit out of it. Then I will go to my transform and I decrease the size back to 100%. But this does not really look like particles, but I can just change the brightness and drag this down and particles. These ones are already doing pretty much the thing that they want. They are kind of like moving up and doing their particle thing, but I think particles are a little bit faster than just the smoke. So to reveal the effects, the expressions that I have applied, I hit E twice. Then I see all my expressions. I can go to the offset turbulence and I can change this to maybe -300. This way these particles are moving a little bit quicker than the rest. Then I take this layer and I simply set this one to screen or add, and now I have my particles on top. So simple. Let's do this together. And then comes the complicated part. We still have time. It's gonna be all right. We duplicate the bottom layer, which has the turbulent noise applied to it. Then we take that layer and we drag it to the top. Maybe we rename it and call this one particles. On the particles layer, we want to change the following options. The contrast should be a lot stronger. For that, I suggest holding down the shift key and increasing the value like crazy. So you're at like 3000. You can do whatever, it's all fine. Then we want to make this overall a little bit smaller. So we go to the transform and change the scale back to 100. We then see something like a weird cow pattern, which is not what we are looking for. So we play around with the brightness setting, again holding down the shift key and dragging this down until we only have some small particles, which are automatically doing their particle glowy thing and moving upwards because of the expression that are still applied to the effect. So far, so good. All right. Now we want them to move a little bit quicker, so we select the particles layer and we hit the letter E, like expression, twice. Not I, E. Then we should see the two effects, or the two properties, where we have the expression applied. We want to change the offset turbulence, and the second value should be -300. Then we change the blending mode of the particles to screen. Where's my screen? Up there. And then we should see how we have the particles on top. We're getting very close to the hard part. I will now do the next steps right until the hard part. And then we get to that point, and then we'll see. As I said, I'm not quite sure if I'm doing it in the best way. I'm just doing it however I usually do it, but yeah, let's see. Alrighty. So, what we want to do next is create some, we need to create something where we can place our elements in 3D space. So I select my 3D camera tracker. I realize that I forgot to enable the detailed analysis, but I'm, what, still mostly flat scene? What the fuck? Let's change this to typical and see if we get better points. Oh yes, now I get the points that I want. Awesome. So I scrub through my timeline and I will see if I can find points that are preferably on this blue thing here. So I can see I have some points over here, and I have a point over here, and I have a third one all the way back here. So I will simply click on it, then I hold down the Shift key, I click on another one, and as we might know, to create a flat surface, we need at least 3 points. And we click here, and now I have the plane selected in 3D space. The center is not where the center is here, but that's fine. I could take this one. I think then the plane will be slightly off, but then at least we have the origin a little bit better in the center. Let's do it like this. Then I right-click on one of the points, and I will say that I want to create a null and a camera. Now I have a super tiny null object right in the center and a camera. Then I will take my grid and I will place it into my scene. Of course, I need to make this one 3D, so I toggle the button down here, and I take the grid all the way to the top, and I make it 3D. Now, right now, it might sit in a really weird position where the camera just moves past it, so I need to place it wherever my null is. Do you remember how to do that? Yeah, with the parent and holding down Shift. Exactly. You're on fire. I hold down Shift and I parent it to the track null, and I can see how it immediately jumps to the center here. Awesome. So when I play this back, maybe again at a quarter, I can see how this now sticks nicely to the center there. Now I just need to adjust it in the size and the rotation. So I hit S for the scale, and I increase the size, then I hit R for the rotation, and here we can see that everything is zeroed out because the basic rotation and stuff is already been taken care of by the track null. So this one here, because it's parented to the track null, starts off at completely 0. So I can now just say my Z rotation and rotate it a little bit until it matches quite nicely in here. I might want to adjust the position here a little bit, and I can see that it is a little bit off towards the back there, but I don't think that that there's an easy fix for now. I guess I should not have taken the last point here, which offset my entire plane a little bit. I mean, I could try changing, just playing around with the rotations a bit, and maybe rather stick a bit more towards the inside here, and then for our example here, this should be fine. So when I play this back, it's opening up and it's sticking nicely to the film footage. Okay. Now this is the easy part still. What would come next is the hard part. So let's get to this, and then we need to try to be concentrated. Alrighty, so let's go back to our measure composition. In there, we select our layer, and we go to the effects controls panel. Just down here, we have the grid, and you go back to measure. Or it should be still open down here. We select the layer here. We go to the effects controls. We double check if it used the correct method. For some reason, it still took the mostly flat scene, which is not good. So we open up the advanced options and force it to use the typical. Good? All right. Next. Once the bar is gone, we can select the camera tracker and we should see a couple of points. You might want to move through the timeline until you see points that are all on top of the blue part.
It's so impressive how you can do that. To be honest.
So I click on the point over here, on a point back there, on a point here. Maybe this time I leave away this point because this point is a little bit too low and therefore it's offsetting everything a little bit. So maybe let's just select these 3 points. You only see points when you have the effect selected.
Okay, why do you make
You can also increase the size of the points. It might make it a little bit easier to select them.
What should I select?
Points that are on the blue part. Just click on them and then shift click to select the next one.
No, to see the points. I should
Oh, to see the point, sorry. Select the effect up here.
Does it have to be on top of it?
and now
Yeah. We want to create a solid and a null object and a camera for this. Right click on one of the selected points, not on another one, on one of the selected ones, and choose create null and camera. Then we should have a null object. It might not be exactly in the center here, but it's fine. We can always offset our layer later on.
Right click. On the points.
Null and camera.
Yes.
Then we go back to the project panel and we want to drag in our grid. So we take the grid layer and we drag it into our measure composition down here, all the way at the top. Then I would say we go through the timeline to a point where the grid is completely expanded. So somewhere around 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds. Just then we want to make the grid 3D. To make the grid 3D, we need to see our buttons here. So we click on the toggle switches. And we enable the 3D icon.
Then we click the box, right?
Yeah, we enable the box. Then we need to move it to where the null object is. So we use the pick whip and we choose the track null, but before we release the mouse, we hold down the shift key.
Can we not hold the shift key before we grab and force it?
That also works. The important part is that you release the mouse first before you release the shift key.
And what's the difference just to parent it?
If we parent it, it's like this. This is the null, and this is the grid. If we parent it, nothing happens. Only later on we see that they are connected. If we hold down shift, it will do like this.
Yeah.
This is what the shift key does, moving the child to the parent.
What's confusing, right?
Square in mind. I wonder why.
Just smack it. It's a thing that is so cool.
So far, so good? Okay. Next, we want to scale this up. So with the grid selected, we hit S and we increase the scale until it roughly has the correct size. Then we want to move it more to the center. Because it is parented to a null object that already sits on the correct plane, now we can hit P and just change the position properties until it looks like it's sitting in the center. The only property you are not allowed to change is the Z position. You can, however, change the X and the Y position to adjust it. Then you can hit R for the rotation and change the Z rotation until this sits nicely within the frame. You can, of course, also use the move tool and move it along these axes here.
But we want it to be in some custom, right?
We want it to be inside of it. Exactly. You can, of course, also move it manually, but don't click it blindly. Always hover over one axis at a time when you move it.
Okay.
Edges are not exactly accurate.
What happens if you do that? How accurate?
Just like in Cinema 4D, if I have this sitting on a plane, if I use the axes, it's moving on this plane. If I move it based on my camera view, like right now, and I click it, it would be moved down here and through the floor, for instance.
Kann man das Objekt nochmal größer machen, das Grid?
Of course. You can always adjust the size again if you want to.
Wenn man einfach S
Yeah,
How perfect does it have to be?
not too perfect. Depending on the points that we have selected, it might not fit exactly anyways, so rather make it a little bit smaller.
This is the way it should be. Look at this beauty.
Yeah, in my scenario, I can also see the points that I've taken were probably also not that perfect, so it is still a little bit rotated at some point where it shouldn't be.
Mine fits perfectly. No, he tweeted it again. No. I'm gonna do it.
Alrighty, so far so good? Okay. Now for the complicated part. Watch, try to understand, and afterwards we try to do it together. So I want this glowy thing on each side of my grid. And this placement of it kind of sucks. Maybe we can do it with snapping. Oh, let's try with snapping. Maybe that makes things easier. Let's see. Otherwise, it will be super. In both cases, it sucks. So I take my glow composition and I drag it down here. I will make it 3D and I will shift parent it to my grid. So now the glow part sits exactly on it. Then I will change the anchor point. So we know when I rotate this, it rotates from the center. So I want this obviously rotated by 90 degrees, but it should be at the bottom here. So I hit A for the anchor point and I increase the position of the anchor point. Because the anchor point always sits where the position is, changing the anchor point means moving the image behind the anchor point upwards. So I change the Y value of this to 2000. So now the anchor point sits exactly at the bottom. Now I need to move this precisely to this point here on the edge. And maybe we can use snapping, which will make things a little bit easier. So I take my move tool, I enable snapping, and I have hotspot snapping or feature snapping already enabled. Then I will click here and I move it, and oh my god, it's snapping. So nice. Okay. And then I hit Command D to duplicate it, and I again click close to the axis, not on it, just close to it. Then I drag it, and then I let it snap. Oh my god. Then I somehow need to make it snap to this part in the back, which I don't see. Maybe I hide this one. Then I duplicate it, I click and drag, and I let it snap. Oh my god, this is working so well. I change the rotation to not 0. On the y-axis to 90, and I
smoke box.
exactly, and I duplicate it, and the duplicated one I again move over and let it snap. Then I can turn on the other one. I select all of them and I set them to screen. And when I now play this back, I have this nice box around it.
Why do we keep we take away the grid, right, afterwards?
No, the grid is always there. The nice thing is, because everything is parented, if I change the grid, I'm also changing the box itself. Alrighty. Let me just show you what my alternative was, because I totally forgot that we can now snap. Because in earlier versions we can't. And I'm old, so sometimes I don't remember new stuff. The alternative would have been to take the glow, drop it in here, just like before, change the anchor point once it's, come on, 3D. And then I would take a null object and I would just rotate it around. So anchor point 2000, then rotation 90, and I move it on the position to 2000. Then I would create a null object, place the null object exactly where the grid is, then I duplicate the glow, parent it to the null object, take the null object and rotate it by 90 degrees. Close, that was the wrong axis. This is the right one. So maybe -90, and then I could just duplicate the glow, unparent the previous one, and rotate it again by another 90 degrees. And so on. So this would have been my alternative. But I guess the snapping is easier, is it? Yeah. Let's do it with the snapping. Together. We take the grid, not the grid, the glow, and we drop the glow into our measure composition towards the top. We make it 3D, and we shift parent it to the grid. It's important that it's parented to the grid and not the tracker. Glow, make it 3D, and then you shift parent it to the grid. So now it should lie flatly on the surface there. Yeah? Then we hit R for the rotation and we change the X rotation to 90 degrees. Then we move it upwards by changing the anchor point. We hit A for the anchor point and we change the Y value to 2000. Then we can already use the snapping. For the snapping, we use the move tool, enable snapping, and the only snapping that we are interested in is this feature snapper. This one here snaps like these smart guides to something that is close to it, and it snaps on the same line, but this is not what we want, just the feature snapper. And this one works the following. Let me just very quickly show you in another example, just very, very quickly. I have one object, let's make this white. And when I make this smaller, and I have another one, and I duplicate it, when I now snap things, take a look here, this works very differently than in other programs. When I hover over an edge, I can see how the icon changes. See how usually it's just this square? But when I click and drag, it gets highlighted, because this is where my mouse is closest. Now this one will be used to snap to other things, like corner points, or edges, or lines in between. So it will not snap the element all together. It will always snap that point that you clicked closest to. Don't click on the point exactly, because then you would scale the layer. Click close to it, thereby it gets activated, and this will now be the thing that will be snapped to other things. So, back in our example, let me zoom in. I want to click close to the point, not on it, just close to it. I can see how it gets this outline around it. Then I can move it, and then it will snap. Let's do it. So, selection tool, snapping enabled, and then moving it.
But when I
Yeah, I did all the steps.
All right, next we can move towards the end of the timeline because there we can see a bit more. So we hit Command D to duplicate the glow. Then we again click and drag, and this time we drag it towards the back. After that, we can duplicate it one more time. And this time we move it to the front here. It needs to be rotated along the y-axis. So we hit R and change the y rotation to 90 degrees. And then it should close up over here. You can also use negative 90 degrees, because that way we have it a little bit more random and doesn't feel so mirrored. The y rotation, negative 90. Then we can duplicate this layer one more time. And we can hide the other glows so they are not in the way. We can then move it to the back and let it snap. And we can then show the other glows and change the blending mode to screen.
Every glow's blending mode or which blending mode?
On all the glows, it should be screen.
Is there a way to do it all together?
Yeah, just select all of them at the same time. And when you change one, all the others change as well. So far, so good. It is really slow. You should really change it from full to a quarter, then it will be a little bit faster, but the final rendering will be super slow because the evolution of our turbulent noise just takes a lot of time to calculate. Are we good?
Yes.
This was the hardest part. Yay!
Okay, wait.
Now it gets only easier. Isn't it nice? I will do the next steps first, afterwards we will do them together. What I want is this circle thing that's... Oh no, before I do the circle thing, let's have the glow actually appear. So our grid is opening up, and as soon as the grid is opened up, that's where the glow should happen. So at around 3 seconds or so, this glow should grow. The nice thing is that the anchor point is already at the bottom here. So I can select the glow, I can hit S for the scale, unconstrain the proportions. I don't really have to do it for all of them. I will change the Y size to 0. Then I activate the stopwatches, go 30 frames forward. 1, 2, 3. And I change this to 100. Then I select only the back keyframes and I change it to a high influence like 88. Or maybe I use 88 and 22 and I just select all of them. Then when I play this back, I can see how the grid grows and then it explodes. Let's do it together. We start by selecting all of our glows. We go to around 3 seconds. With the glow selected, we hit S for the scale. We want to unconstrain the proportions. We change the Y scale, which is the second one, to 0. And we have the owls again. We activate the stopwatch. Go 30 frames forward. And we change our Y scale to 100. Now, of course, these keyframes should be eased, so we select all of the keyframes. Go to any KB. I would use 88 and 22 because I'm lazy. And I hit apply. Velocity. No, do it on all of them. just select all the keyframes and
Before that, is there any change that we make? So first
yeah, of course.
0.
The first ones are 0 and the second ones are 100. Let's do the thinking thing. The chew. I will do it. I do it first, afterwards we do it together. Command N for a new composition and make it 500 by 500. We will use something that we haven't used before. We could also do it differently, but why would we do something that we've done before, you know? You might think, well, I could create a solid, I could apply a circle, I could apply a radial wipe, and just animate that one, right? You could, but this is different, what we will do. In the end, it looks exactly the same, but we have some small other options. I will create a shape layer. People need to watch now. New stuff. We important. To create a shape layer, I just have nothing selected. Then I will use one of my masks here, for instance, the ellipse tool, and I create an ellipse. A shape layer looks already fundamentally different than other layers. I can see it gets this nice icon over here. Also, shape layers by default have the sun icon enabled, which means they are always scalable without getting blurry. Shape layers are super fucking complicated because they consist of so many things. Right now, I have at least 3 different positions. I have A, the position of the layer itself. I have B, the position of my ellipse inside of the transform, which tells it where the ellipse itself should be within the layer. And then for the ellipse path, I also have a position which tells me where inside of the position of the ellipse should actually be generated. So I have 3 different positions. This is totally fucked up. But in some weird way, it totally makes sense. We don't want to think about it though. So we try to keep things very simple. And to do so, you need to follow my lead. You will, after I've done this, you click on the ellipse and then you double click it. This way it creates an ellipse with everything nicely centered. Oh, it will already be circular and not elliptical because our composition is square. With the ellipse selected, I can either have one of these 2 tools selected, and therefore I get the options for it up here. I can change my fill, color, I can click on the fill text to choose that it should be none. I can then go to the color here, I will choose white. I can change the thickness of this, and then I just hit S for the scale and scale this down. Do not try to touch anything here. Just don't. Don't touch shape layers. You will never touch what you want to touch. So, select the layer itself and always know what you are getting. Because when you click here, you might either select the layer or the ellipse as a group or the ellipse as a path. So, and also when you scale it, you can either scale the ellipse as a path, the transform of the group of the ellipse, or the scale of the entire layer. So we always have these 3 different things, and it gets really messy. So try to not touch things here, only go down here and change the values that you know you want to change. Like the S for the scale of the layer, and then I scale it down. It does make sense in a way. If I just very quickly in another composition create multiple ellipses, they can be within the same layer. So I have one layer that contains both ellipses. Then inside of each ellipse, I have transform properties, so I could scale just this ellipse up and down. Or I could take the scale of the entire layer and therefore scale both of them at the same time. So it makes sense, and in some rare scenarios, it does make sense to have this control, but most of the times we want one shape inside of one layer. So if I want to have another ellipse, but it should be different, I make sure that I don't have the shape layer selected, I create another ellipse, and I can see how this now is its own shape layer, and it just makes things a lot simpler for me. On here, just like with the text layer, I have effects that I can apply to the contents. With the add button here, I click on the little play button, and then I will go on to the trim paths. With the trim paths, I open up the options, and I have a start and an end. This is much like the stroke that we did maybe at some point with a map. So I can say where this should start and where this should end. So apparently it should start while it's closed. I activate the stopwatches. I go 30 frames forward, and I change my end, so this should grow, and then I change the start, show it should shrink, and when I play this back, I don't see anything, because...
It turned one time and one time.
Exactly. I reveal it and hide it at the same time, and therefore nothing happens. If I then take my start and tell it to appear later, it first appears and then it disappears, like this. Then I can give this whole thing some nice easing. Maybe I keep the 88 and 22, I'm not sure. And then I have a nice animation like this. Then I will animate this multiple times. But no, I'm actually too lazy, so I will write some little code. Very simple code. I alt-click on the stopwatch, and what I want is, I want this to loop. So I type in loop out. Then, just like with a function, I use the brackets. And then inside here, as a string, I need to type in the type. By default, I think when you type in nothing, it will be cycle anyways, but cycle is the one that I want to do. Cycle means it does something, and then it just does the same thing again, and the same thing again, and the same thing again. It always starts from the beginning. I copy this code, and I place it onto my end here as well. Just copy pasting it. And when I play this back, it looks fucked up. The reason is that these animations don't have the exact same time. They happen like one after another, and the loop is just not synchronized. I need to make sure that my animations have the exact same distance. So this starts here, and this one needs to start here as well. So I just create another keyframe. Nothing happens here for the first value, but now it knows it's supposed to be this length. Then I go to the end here, and I give here another keyframe, so that the end also knows this is how long the entire animation is. Once I've done that, I can play this back, and we'll play back in a loop. On top of this, I can then alt-click on the offset, and I can type in value by time, and I change the value to 90, and when I now play this back, maybe 180, I can see how it no, 90 is fine. How it's just rotating constantly. And I have this super beautiful loop. Bless you.
Just send us that.
Now we do it together. We start by creating a new composition. This time we choose a different size. 500 by 500 will be more than enough.
Frame rate 30.
Frame rate 30. And we hit OK. Here we choose the ellipse tool in the top left. So click and drag and choose the ellipse tool. And just double click on the tool, and you should have an ellipse here. Yours might be white with a red border or something. Or like this. Then, while you're still within the ellipse tool, you can change the properties up here. To get rid of the fill, you click on the name where it says fill, a pop-up opens, and you can choose none as the fill method. Then for the stroke, you can just click on the stroke color to define the color.
How many pixels?
No. I think 30 will look okay later on. you choose the ellipse tool up here, and you double click on it. And then you should have an ellipse.
Oh, no, like I have this one. Wrong.
No, delete that. You should not create a circle, and not that thing. Delete the layer completely. You should have nothing in there.
Like empty space.
Exactly.
Now
And with an empty space, you double click on the ellipse tool.
Oh. Yes, now I have.
Exactly. Then you click on the name fill up here.
The color?
On the name fill,
Yes.
not on the color.
Yes.
In the pop-up, you choose the strike through one.
Yes.
Then you go to the stroke, change the color to white, and the width to 30.
Yes.
That's it.
This one?
Exactly.
Do I need to have background? Like,
No. Then we hit S for the scale, and we just scale it down a little bit. Now the rest happens down here. Let's close and open up the options of the layer again. Next to contents, we see the add, and we click on the play button. And we choose the trim paths from the drop-down, or the list. We should now see underneath contents, we have the ellipse 1 and the trim paths 1. Yeah? Then we open up the trim paths 1, and we change both the start and the end to 0. Then we make sure that we are at the beginning of the timeline, and we activate the stopwatches for the start and the end. We go, I think it should be a bit faster. We go 20 frames forward, Command Shift, and the right arrow key twice, and we change both values to 100. We want this to be eased, so we select the keyframes, go to any.green, and hit apply. 88 and 22. We zoom in a little bit so that we can see the keyframes a bit better, and we offset them. The start keyframes, so the top ones, should happen a little bit later, so just drag them a bit to the right. When you then play it back, it should look like this. Yes? Good. Now we want to add our little expression. We alt-click on the stopwatch of the start, and we type in loop out in parentheses and quotation marks. We type in cycle. Uppercase and lowercase is, as we know, in code very crucial. So everything is lowercase except for the O of the out. No. We do it on the start. Alt-click on the stopwatch of the start value. And we type in loop out cycle. That's fine. Just ignore it. It says it's disabled while you are editing text. If you're done editing text, that will disappear. You can copy this text, and then you can alt-click on the stopwatch of the end and paste it in. If it worked, we should not get any error message, and when we play back, at the beginning it looks fine, and then it's very fucked up, but it's doing something. So far, so good? Now to fix it, we just need to make sure that the animations happen exactly at the same time. So the start and the end need to be matching. We go to the beginning of the timeline, and we just add an additional keyframe for the start by clicking this icon. Then we go to the end of our animation, maybe hold down Shift so that you snap to that keyframe, and you activate the keyframe icon here for the end. So it should look like this now.
Do we change any values or do we just
No,
position?
just add a new keyframe that keeps the current value.
It speeds up faster.
And then it should look like this. Alrighty! Now the last thing that we want to add here is alt-clicking on the stopwatch of the offset, and we type in a value of 90 degrees. And we use the expression like we used earlier, which is value multiplied by time. No, alt-click on the stopwatch.
Option
What do we write?
Value by time, and our offset should be 90, and then our end result should be this. Does it look like this?
Want to go quicker?
All right. I think this is fine for today. We know all the parts. The last options would just be placing this comp into the other one, placing it in 3D space, and having that text appear. But I don't think we need to do that. There will be no homework because we already see each other again in 2 days.
Like, I'm happy.
Yeah, sure.
Is that this Wednesday?
Yeah, it's this Wednesday. The reason is that this quarter is shorter than the others, so there's 1 week missing and we need to have 10 sessions.
There's 1 week missing. That explains a lot.
Yeah,
Just that.
because of reasons.
No, because they're not giving us because of work. They're just.
Wait, why is it?
Yeah, it's
like homework?
I guess.
instead of 10 weeks, we only have 9 weeks, so we have this.
Getting all these
one.
extra classes.
Exactly.
Why have we got less time? I don't understand. Why do we have less time?
It has to do with the beginning of the year, because of the holidays, the first days. The first week is sort of cut off, so it's not an entire week. And the end of the quarter, because the graduation is always on a Friday, it's also not a full week, so it's kind of like we couldn't catch up the time there. So it does make sense, and this is why we get all these extra classes in between. So, on Wednesday we see each other again, and then we will do the third example. I haven't animated it yet, but what I imagine this could do is super fancy. We will... Oh. Wait. Well, then don't play it back if you can't. Still not. Where's my other player? Come on. I'm getting there. I still don't understand which one it is. Which? So what I imagine this to happen, it's a trash can, but it has these 2 holes in it. And it has this nice little bit of a reflection going on. And I think it would be cool if we had like a little ball that jumps out of the big hole, like phew, and in the small one. And then we have this loop. I was just like, phew. Because then we have to see how we can mask this out and how we could fake a 3D reflection on here.
Man, I think this is cool the way it is. Too cool. So cool.
I'm not buying it. So, this is what we will do on Wednesday.